will turn now to our next presenter, Michael Hicks, who will be presenting the Mormon Tabernacle Choir and FDR. Michael Hicks is a professor emeritus of music at Brigham Young University. He has authored dozens of historical and analytical articles and books, such as the Encyclopedia of Popular Music of the World and the Oxford Handbook of Mormonism, and journals that include Journal of the American Musicological Society and Perspectives of New Music. The most recent of his 5 books in University of Illinois Press's Music in American Life series was The Mormon Tabernacle Choir, a Biography, 2015. He has twice won the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award, 1994 and 2003, for his writing about music, and a third time as editor of the journal American Music, a post he held from 2007 to 2010. For other aspects of his career, compositions, recordings, poetry, etc., see www.michaelhicks.org. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much. You can hear me fine? Yes? Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
you're good.
To verify that. And can you see this on the screen? My slide
Yes,
up.
your slides are looking good.
Thank you very much. All right, so I'm going to take you through a small 3-act play here today, and this is the poster for that play. This is the centennial booklet for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which I will refer to as the Mormon Church throughout this. And this is a really important image for what is about to unfold. You can see here the hand on the torch of liberty, and from the torch is emerging this plume of smoke, and you can see that you can see that at the tail of the smoke here, there's the Salt Lake Temple floating on the airwaves. I'll just leave that image in your mind here. Now, Act 1, radio. It's fair to say that the American radio industry was born during Prohibition and came of age in the Great Depression. And I need you to understand, or remember at least 3 things about radio that would make that coming of age happen. One is it was a spiritual medium. That is, it was sort of the afterclap of spiritualism itself, where you have voices that are, emerging from the air, from unknown sources, and what was their conveyance, and that it was available anywhere, at least anywhere you had a receiver. The second thing is it was an economical medium. So you had costs for a receiver, costs for the power for the receiver, but no cost for a steady supply of content. And third, it was informational. So people could represent themselves directly without the curatorship of journalists or critics, or in the case of FDR, when he was governor of New York, 1928 through 1932, without the curatorship of the state legislature. So he cultivated for himself the benefits of radio by having these, what became later in his presidency, fireside chats. The delivery was relatively slow. The vocabulary was simple. He was not preaching at or giving speeches to people, but he was conversing with them. And so he's tapping into the kind of spiritual and even intimate side of radio. The Mormon Church had long wanted to tap into the directly speaking to the people possibilities of radio. When they began the church in 1830, within 2 years, they actually had their own newspaper. And through the years, they cultivated their own magazines, newspapers. And here was the premise. I hope you can read this. This is the masthead of the magazine, or the newspaper, The Mormon, 1855. It is better to represent ourselves than to be represented by others. That's the sort of core principle of all of this media interest of the church. And you can see here, 1922, here is the leader of the church, Heber J. Grant, speaking into microphone, the first words of the church-owned radio station, KZN then, it later became KSL. And he actually talked about how radio was a fulfillment of prophecy, of voices from the heavens speaking to man and circumscribing the globe and so forth. Now, I want to just show you one other thing about radio in the church at this time, 1920s. This is from the church's magazine, great title of this magazine, The Improvement Era, which fits in nicely with the era that we're just entering in the 1930s. And you can see here, the title is Preaching the Gospel Through Radio. And down here where the arrow is pointing, this statement, many an indifferent person has openly admitted that radio has done more to convince him of the immortality of things and of the existence of deity than any other intermediary. I wish I had time to repeat that, because there's so much packed into that about the power of radio to bring people into another world. Now, a radio program that was first local and then became a national program started at radio station KZN and then KSL, Salt Lake City. And by 1932, the first election year of FDR, it had moved to Sunday mornings on CBS, and it took on the title The Hour Harmonious. And it featured the Tabernacle Choir, then known as the Salt Lake Tabernacle Choir, because they didn't want to have any sectarian or proselyting or specifically religious tinge to the group on the air for legal reasons and so forth. And it also had organ solos and the voice of Richard Evans, who had a voice that was conversational in many ways, high-toned, and had the sort of idealism that in some ways harmonized with that of FDR. Well, in 1932, FDR came to the Mormon Tabernacle to give a campaign speeches in September. And you can see here that he appeals to the Mormon sense of pioneering. It is clear to me, he says, that if we can change the conditions of nature that made a place a desert, we ought to have faith in the possibility of changing the economic conditions sufficiently to bring the producer and the consumer more closely together to the benefits, for the benefit of each. That's a revision in his talk there. I won't read further, but he appealed to Mormon pioneering, that improvement era sense of things. His message caught on, and that November he won the Utah vote, a reliably, normally Republican vote, by 56%. That victory was a kind of gauntlet thrown down in what I will call here the battle of the presidencies. Act 2, the New Deal. So the Mormon Church's three-man presidency was politically divided. You had Heber J. Grant at the top. Grant truly hated FDR. I'll just leave it at that. It's true. But his first counselor was Anthony Ivins, also his cousin, a very strong FDR supporter and an avid Democrat, we'll say. His second counselor was J. Reuben Clark, who had actually worked in the Hoover administration and tried to stay out of this political fray between the president and the first counselor, these two cousins. But Anthony Ivins died in 1934, and at that point, Clark became the first counselor, and he and Heber J. Grant created a sort of a solidarity there that was anti-FDR and anti-New Deal specifically. Now, here were their arguments against the New Deal. They didn't like the funding of programs because the windfall of taxes on alcohol were funding these programs, and that was because of the repeal of prohibition, and they really opposed the repeal of prohibition. That's a whole other story. Second, they didn't like the pseudo-monarchical tactics of FDR. This was a common complaint. He was too much of an authoritarian. And they said specifically the divinely inspired Constitution, which is something found in Mormon scripture, was under threat. The second things relate to these phrases that they used quite a bit. One was the evils of the dole, because part of the redemption of mankind was that he had to work. And that was part of his duty, as they say here, since Eden. And any charitable support should require work. So they were okay with, say, WPA programs and so on. But anything that reeked of, say, Social Security, one that they attacked specifically and created their own church program in response to it, that was wrong. No one should be able to live off of any sort of support unless they're working. And the last one here, masses against the classes. That's a phrase you'll hear a lot with Heber J. Grant. So there was the implicit Bolshevism of FDR and the New Deal that would upend established social orders. Now, there was one aspect of the New Deal that they supported because it helped the church out, and that was the rural electrification program. And specifically because it helped the spread of radio. That helped the church in two ways. One, Heber J. Grant, J. Reuben Clark could now speak directly to members of the church in rural areas. And that was a lot of the Great Basin, of course, farming communities and so forth. But also, they could spread this national broadcast even further. That was, even though it was the Salt Lake Tabernacle Choir, everyone knew that it was the Mormon church that was behind it. And so I've got this picture here just to show you this wonderful image of a rural man and his daughter by the radio tuning in. Just another one here. I love this shot as well, with this radio as he's reading the newspaper on the side. But by this time, by the Rural Electrification Act's announcement, the church had already decided that, at least the church leaders had decided, they were going to support Alf Landon as president. Clark actually wrote campaign materials for Landon, and Landon had told Clark that if he were elected, Landon, would appoint J. Reuben Clark as Secretary of State. So there was a lot of intersection there. And you'll find the church having to grapple, these church leaders at least, having to grapple with the church being ostensibly neutral, but still getting these digs at FDR and the New Deal into their rhetoric. You'll find it in conference talks, some articles in the Improvement Era, for example. And right before the election, they finally said, we've got to do something because the people are loving FDR. They love these programs and so on. And so you'll see here, this is the Deseret News on October 31st, 1936. This is the church-owned newspaper, and you'll see right in the center there, an editorial, The Constitution. I won't go through it with you. It's a, I won't say great editorial, but this was ghostwritten by Reuben Clark, and he's explaining how the current president, doesn't use the name, but it's very clear, the current president is violating the Constitution with his authoritarian rule. Well, the Democrats in Utah quickly responded with ads like this: Roosevelt saved the Constitution. Our Constitution and democracy were definitely threatened under Hoover. They were in danger because the nation was deteriorating, etc. I won't go through this ad with you. And don't even get me started on political cartoons, except to show you this one. And so you see, here's FDR with these sort of glowing, sort of monster-like eyes there. And you can see he's writing here, full speed ahead, never mind the Constitution, FDR. And you can see the Communist Party off on the left, of course. He's good enough for me. And this, I guess, Mormon woman being outraged or shocked by that Communist Party support for FDR. Well, it didn't really matter because Heber J. Grant actually conceded that the Latter-day Saints at this time, and I'm quoting him here, he said, quote, about half the Latter-day Saints almost worship FDR, end quote. Now, the Tabernacle Choir and its broadcasts were walking a tightrope here because, you know, they didn't want to transgress the feelings of their leaders, their bosses, you might say, but they also had to promote a sense of national harmony. That was their function. It was increasing at this time. Now, I think that the Tabernacle Choir's broadcasts actually helped FDR's reelection in a couple of ways. One, this sense of, like I say, sort of non-political or non-partisan, certainly non-sectarian national unity that everyone was trying to work towards in this era of depression. And actually in August of 36, Richard Evans came up with this tagline for the ends of these broadcasts, which took on the generic name by now, Music and the Spoken Word. And the tagline was, wishing you peace this day and always. So it's about peace, not war, not contention. And also, well, let me just say that, again, the voice of Richard Evans had this harmonious relationship to FDR's. And so you could actually write letters that would get to Richard Evans in Salt Lake by just addressing them. And I've seen copies of these, The Voice, Salt Lake City, Utah. And it went to Richard Evans because everyone knew what The Voice was. This voice coming from the Music and the Spoken Word broadcast, the voice urging peace. Well, Utah reelected Roosevelt 69% this time. And shortly after the second inauguration, Heber J. Grant wrote this in his diary. I woke this morning just about 5 minutes after 12 o'clock, and it is now a little after 4 o'clock, and I have not been able to go to sleep. Thinking of the outrageous way I feel things are being run in Washington under the direction of President Roosevelt. It is with great difficulty that I can keep from calling upon every Latter-day Saint in the name of the Lord to rise up and rebel against Roosevelt's administration. Well, Act 3, War. I'm going to show you this image, wonderful image from the scrapbook of Spencer Cornwall, who was the director of the Tabernacle Choir at this time. And you can see here, J. Reuben Clark, who by now in 1939 was really the leader of the church because of Grant's growing, we'll say, chronic infirmities. But I love this image because here's the nation, the United States, and there is Reuben Clark speaking on the CBS airwaves, and there underneath, it's a foundation now, not just a plume of smoke, but sort of as a foundation to this sort of haloed speaker is the Tabernacle Choir in these national broadcasts. So sort of spreading across the nation and bringing the nation together in some ways. Well, behind the scenes, of course, Mormon leaders were continuing their anti-New Deal rhetoric, but they were also concerned, come 1940, about the president being reelected. One reason, beyond their anti-New Deal rhetoric, was that he was, of course, seeking a third term, and the feeling was that was not constitutional. This was a very common reason to oppose FDR at the time. Another reason, though, and Clark was very specific about this, in private at least, he felt that FDR was trying to bring the nation into war. And obviously, many people were trying to keep the nation out of the war breaking out in Europe at that time. But the church still had to remain neutral. It would sneak in things like this. This is the Deseret News in June. Actually, this is, I can't see the date here, but this is actually in the fall of 1940. And the third term principle, they actually talked about this as a principle that was violating the Constitution. This is just an excerpt from that editorial. But you know, this is just to show you this box here. The Tabernacle Choir had become as much, and these broadcasts of the Tabernacle Choir had become as much as kind of a state church as this country has ever had. You have boxes and boxes like this of letters, fan letters from the 1930s in the church archives, still not cataloged. So you understand that as librarians. But here we have letters and then answers, carbon copies of answers by Evans to these people. And I'll give you here just one excerpt from one letter, because this is very characteristic. This is the third one down in this slide. Bill Brown to Mormon Tabernacle, 2nd March, 1941. I have reached the point where I cannot attend an ordinary Protestant church without being disgusted by everything about it. So the Tabernacle program is my only church. If I ever regain the faith I used to have, I imagine it will be through the thought-provoking remarks made on the program. Well, as you know, on December 7, 1941, news of the bombing of Pearl Harbor arrived, and it actually interrupted the Tabernacle Choir broadcasts that Sunday morning on many stations, and we formally entered the Second World War. The following March, the Tabernacle itself was closed to visitors. The choir did continue rehearsing, and leaders of the church said, you have to keep on the air because you're such an important part of pursuing peace. You know, peace this day and always. But a few weeks, let me just leave this with you here. Given in recognition of distinguished service in behalf of national morale in the midst of war, by means of the inspirational influence which comes from a radio program that has captured the interest of millions of listeners, a program which has achieved great spiritual significance in time of trust. This is an award from the National Federation of Presswomen in July 1944. Now, already the previous month, Spencer Cornwall had sort of stepped out of line with the leaders of the church to try to support, in a sense, the war effort with participation in a propaganda film, The Battle of San Pietro. And this was a film being produced by the U.S. Signal Corps. It was directed by John Huston, had music by Dmitri Tiomkin, and they wanted the Tabernacle Choir to sing sort of victory music at the liberation of Italy. This was done, this agreement was done, and the recording was done without the knowledge of J. Reuben Clark. When he found out, said, no, you can't do this. This is a violation of your brand, which is the brand of peace. And he was quite incensed that they were involved in any sort of war effort, even though this was about victory, in a sense, of war. Well, the one concession was at the end, you can see here in the credits, it's the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. It's like, okay, if we're going to do this, if we're going to enter in here, we want to have our branding clear. We're not going to be just the Salt Lake Tabernacle Choir anymore. It's going to be the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. Now, as you know, let me just give you the curtain call for all of this. That November, Utah re-elected FDR, fourth term, against Wendell Willkie, 60% of the vote. But the following April, as you know, FDR suddenly died, and Mormon leaders quietly celebrated. This is J. Reuben Clark. The Lord gave the people of the United States 4 elections in order to get rid of him. That they failed to do so. So he held an election of his own and cast 1 vote and then took him away. That was the attitude of the church leadership. But the Mormon Tabernacle Choir became indelibly associated with the national mourning for FDR in an interesting way. And here's the minutes of the choir. April 12th, 1945. Word was received this afternoon of the death of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. 30 minutes later, the choir officers were called on the telephone and asked to sing a memorial broadcast from 9:30 to 10 p.m. Mr. Douglas Coulter, vice president of CBS, in charge of the broadcast, called at 7:30 p.m. to check on the final details. When he was told that the choir was already assembled and rehearsing, he replied, "Incredible. They thought this was amazing. The choir had come together so quickly and so avidly to mourn FDR. The only thing was this was Thursday evening, 7:30, and they always rehearsed at that time. So yes, they were assembled and rehearsing, ready to go on the air in a couple of hours. So whether by inspiration or serendipity, the Tabernacle Choir became a monolithic national voice of mourning for FDR. A president whom most of the choir's proprietors will say actually despised, but whom probably most of the choir singers had voted for numerous times. And so you can call that amazing grace or amazing irony, but as you know, sometimes it's the same thing. Thanks.